Na kahu o ke kahua la'a. Ha'aheo nā hoa iho ai. Na kahu o ke kahua la'a. Ea ea. Ea ea. Ea ea. Ulia mahi. Ulia mahi a malama. Ke one hanau ke ali'i. Ulia mahi a malama. Ke one hanau ke ali'i. Ea ea. Ea ea. Ea ea. Ea ea. Okahi o mako leo. Okahi o mako leo. No ke ali'i aloha hano hano. Ho'okahi o mātou leo. No ke ali'i aloha hano hano. Ea ea. Ea ea. Ea ea. Ea ea. Haina ka puana. Haina ka puana. Na ki a'i o ka lani ana ole. Haina ka puana.
Okay, aloha wina la kako, okay o Mike. My name is Mike DeMotta. I'm the curator for living collections at the National Tropical Botanical Garden. And I'm with you today at Prince Kuhio Park. And I've been asked to talk a little bit about native plants and canoe plants and things that might have been growing in this area back in the day when the prince was alive and when this area was settled by native Hawaiians and used for a variety of things. So today, we're looking at the zone, and I hope you can see behind me an area that has been under modern agricultural use for a very long time. So it's kind of hard to get a feel for what this area might have been like even before the Hawaiians arrived here. But we're on the leeward dry side of Kauai, and if we look at leeward vegetation on the islands that still have kind of intact dry coastal vegetation, we can pretty much compare what's there on the other islands and other parts of this island to what might have been here. The thing is, though, every area on every island, there are the main climate, which here is a leeward dry climate, but there are many microclimates, and it's hard to know what's under the ground. In other words, if there's artesian water, if there's freshwater springs, and there's water seeping below us, as there is in this part of Kauai, it would have made a big difference as to what could have been growing here. Traditionally, though, when you're really close to the coast as we are here, what they call coastal strand vegetation would have been dominant. And those are things that any one of us who goes to the beach here in Hawaii would see. For example, naupaka, there would have been ilima bushes, pa'u'ohi'iaka, which is a native morning glory with little purple flowers. Lots of that would have been growing along the coastline here, right at the shore break where there's salt spray. Ohelokai, which is related to popolo. It's in that family of plants, and they're small, sprawling. They can have a high salt tolerance and produce little red berries. So I imagine there was a lot of that along the coastline. But as we get further inland and out of the salt spray zone, then we would have found more of a lowland habitat. It's been pretty studied in depth over at Mahaulepu, which is a little bit further down the coastline from here. And they found fossil remains, seeds and such, pollen and all those sorts of things of many different plant species that are associated with higher elevations here on Kauai today. So, as I look around and I, look at and think about what I have seen in the areas around Polihali, for example, some of the trees that would have been in this area before cultivation of farms here would have been things like lonomea, which is a really important native hardwood. Lonomea is not considered rare. You can still find it in places like Waimea Canyon and in all the valleys that are along the Napali coast. It is very salt tolerant. It gets to be a very large tree. And my guess is it's no longer found in this part of the island because it is a hardwood and it would have been harvested for the wood, railroad ties, cattle pasture fencing, and that sort of thing. Another tree that I think was very common in this area was wili wili. There's still a lot of wili wili on the leeward sides of all of our islands. If you go to Kekaha and drive up to Waimea Canyon, there's still patches of wili wili growing in there that survived the big fire from a few years ago. And I imagine wili wili was right down to where this park is even now. And then lots of shrubs, lots of vines. A vine that is no longer common here, or I've never seen it in this area, but was common at one time, is a vine called hu'e. And you can still find that vine growing on other parts of this island. I've seen plenty of it growing along the coast near Hana. I've seen it all over the Big Island in North Kona, and they produce clusters of little blueberries. The reason we know hu'e grows here is because this area is riddled with caves. And some of you might be aware of the blind cave spider that's endemic to the caves here in Koloa. And those spiders prey upon a flightless cricket that feeds on the roots of hu'e, among other plants. So they found the roots of these vines all the way down in the caves deep below the soil here. And so, yeah, hu'e, very dry adapted, and we know why, because it produces deep roots that go down into the moisture that is in the rock below the areas we're standing. So over time, this area would have been cleared, and the Hawaiians would have turned this area into a big agricultural area. But as dry as we are down here, the indigenous Hawaiian way of life was very much in concert with nature. The Hawaiians were a seafaring people. As part of Polynesia, they spent many months at a time on canoes, and their mentality was, if you have to be able to live your life on an island as if you were on a canoe. Your resources are limited. You should never take advantage or overexploit anything. So heva'a he moku heva'a. An island and a canoe is like an island. So they lived in concert with nature, and everything they did was sustainable and actually enhanced ecosystem function, because they realized that water was life, vai and vai. So you could never take advantage or do anything that would disrupt your supply of water and the functions of nature. So all the leeward sides of all the islands had prosperous communities of Hawaiians that lived in concert with their communities of native plants and other animals and birds and so forth, all the way up from here, all the way up to Ahupua to the rainforest. So one of the things that we all know that was a commonly cultivated plant in the drylands was uwala, sweet potato. And there are maybe 3 dozen varieties of sweet potatoes that are Hawaiian varieties that were cultivated on all of the islands, including here. Ni'ihau was famous, for that matter, for their big fields of sweet potato. You read some of the accounts of early Europeans like Captain Cook and George Vancouver, and they describe the big fields of sweet potato being grown on Ni'ihau. Sweet potato does thrive in hot, dry habitat. But the Hawaiians also knew how to take advantage of their freshwater supplies. I'm not specifically familiar with all of the history of this area, but there no doubt were big streams like Waikoma Stream and freshwater springs on all of our islands. The Hawaiians knew how to take advantage of that without depleting the resource. So auai, or ditch systems, were built to bring water to areas that were really important to grow kalo, which is higher yielding when it's grown in a lo'i, in a wetland situation. And so this area is known to have had a number of lo'i from here all the way to Lauai Valley, which is not really that far from here. And then in between the lo'i would have been all of the sweet potato mounds. And so Koloa, again, is famous for the Koloa field system and all the uwala fields that were grown, or the uwala that was grown in the Koloa area. Another important resource that was grown down in this area would have been niu, coconuts. I'm standing under a coconut tree, niu. Coconuts were brought to these islands by the Hawaiians when they sailed up here. And coconuts are probably one of the most useful trees of all of the trees they brought, because every part of a coconut tree has at least 2 uses. And the bigger your family got, the more coconut trees you would plant, so that you would have the resources, the water, the coconut meat, the fibers to make rope, the leaves for thatching, and even you could use the trunks for building hale if necessary. So I imagine there were big groves of coconut trees. Ulu niu would have been found all through this area, in areas that were not used for taro and sweet potato, or kalo and uwala. I think they may have grown also some ava in this area. Ava really likes it wet, and even though this area is really dry right now, the climate in this area is very different today than what it was 200 years ago. When there was still lowland, dry native forest in this area, it would have been a wetter area. The forest attracts clouds. The rain follows the forest, is the saying, and there probably would have been more moisture in this area at one time than there is today. So I imagine as part of a Hawaiian agroforestry planting, they would have planted in the native forested areas where they may have had trees like ko and maybe hala, lonomea. The Hawaiians may have planted ohi'ai, mountain apple, and other trees. And then under the shade of all of these big trees, they could have planted other plants, useful plants, such as ava. And so I think ava, which was an important element in the culture, was probably grown in this area very much. And so when I look at a place like this, I'm challenged by what it looks like today and what it probably looked like before a big agriculture, before sugar, pineapple, and cattle. And I imagine the type of forest that was over here and how the Hawaiians living with nature, how they would have taken advantage of the forest system in such a way that it would have enhanced the forests and the ecosystem function of those forests. And they would have benefited from that, and the forest would have benefited from that lifestyle as well. So as I look around in this particular site, I'm looking at plants that are canoe plants that the Hawaiians brought here, and would have been important for them to propagate and grow in large numbers because they use them so much. You know, we all know that how it can be really hard on our streams. The big rivers on this island of Kauai gets choked by how. But how wasn't a real issue in the old days because the fiber of how, the inner bark, was used as a fiber source and was braided together to make, it wasn't very strong twine, but it was used for binding things and tying things down and that sort of thing. So how, one of the benefits of it is that it does grow really fast, but then they harvested it regularly because they constantly had to make twine, sort of string and rope out of it. So how is kind of a scourge on our streams today because nobody's harvesting it anymore, but it was a very important resource back in the old days. And then the flowers had medicinal uses as well. And as I look around the site here, I see a kukui tree further over. Now kukui is one of the 26 or so plants that came over here on the canoes. And kukui is the same word that's used throughout most of Polynesia, just different forms of that word, kukui, kui, tui, depending on which island group you go to. And it means light. And you know, of course, the oil in the kernel of the nut is very rich and was used for candlelight. One of the archaeological finds that they do find in old sites are bowls, you know, stone bowls that are hollowed out for candles, for candle nut, or kukui nut. So I see a big kukui tree here. The nut is one of the important things. The oil was also used to oil canoes. They would burn the nut for their candlelight, and then the black soot was also used as a dye for tattooing and for tapa cloth. Another tree that I see in this area is hala. Now, even though hala was a canoe plant and came over with the Hawaiians, it is also native, so it's indigenous. It was already growing here when the Hawaiians arrived. They also brought it with them. But the windward sides of all the main Hawaiian islands had huge lowland hala forests, what we call wet lowland hala forest. And hala was a dominant tree, but it would have been growing with ohi'olehua, maile, and a number of native ferns, among other things. And so, you know, hala is very drought tolerant, but it does send its roots very deep and will find the water and is very tolerant of windy, dry areas just like this. Now, hala is very important. It is used medicinally, but the most important and common known use for it are the leaves. So if you call it, often people refer to the tree as puhala and the leaves as lauhala. And lauhala is very thorny. The leaves are very thorny, so they have to be cleaned, stripped of all the thorns and rolled up. The fibers need to be broken down so it's soft and pliable. Then you can weave things. You can strip it down to narrow strips and weave mats, baskets, hats, and many other things out of lauhala. They're very important. Hala trees have two kinds of flowers, either a male flower or a female flower, which then produces the cluster of fruits. The male flower is called hinano. It's very fragrant. In many Hawaiian songs and poetry, they refer to the Big Island, a district called Puna, Puna Paia A'ala Ikahala, which means Puna, whose walls are fragrant with hala, because the folks that lived in Puna on the Big Island were known to bring in the hinano flowers into their houses and stick them in the walls to make the hala smell sweet. I talked a little bit about coconut trees earlier. There are bananas growing in this area as well, and there are a couple of dozen varieties of bananas that are native Hawaiian varieties that the Hawaiians developed over time. And most times bananas were used green. They were boiled and used as a starch, and are actually pretty much like potato, you know, like any other starch food. The juice in the banana sap was had medicinal uses, as well as the flour or the bract portion of it. And then the stumps, as anybody knows who's made imu, the banana stumps and leaves are essential for cooking in the underground oven. So the bananas are also heavily used And so they grew a lot of bananas because they harvested it regularly. Even before the banana plant had its fruit, they were using the stumps, the leaves, and the juices from inside of the stumps. So bananas, yeah, very important. Then I see there's a bunch of tea leaf plants growing here. Tea plants are also very important because they had a lot of medicinal uses. Tea leaf was used religiously as well. The plants are very long-lived, and it's amazing how well they do down here in these dry areas. They tend to get very big in wetter zones. The leaves, among other uses, the leaves are used to wrap food that is then cooked in the underground oven. Some of the great photographs that I've seen at the Bishop Museum, though, are of Hawaiians working in rainforests that have made raincoats out of tea leaf, and also rolling them up, braiding them, and making footwear as they cross over some of the jagged lava flows on the Big Island. Another big tree that's growing in this area is breadfruit, what we call ulu. Again, ulu is one of the main important starch foods or staples in the Hawaiian diet. Ulu trees that are growing here are really big, and it's very impressive to see them doing so well in such a dry habitat. There is only one known variety that we're aware of Hawaiian ulu, but there are many other varieties throughout the Pacific and in the Indian Ocean. Breadfruit ulu is an important staple food all over the Pacific Islands through the Indian Ocean. It originated down in Southeast Asia, and they have different species of it. The ulu trees that have been documented at NTBG, and we have the Breadfruit Institute headquartered at our organization. Dr. Ragoni has done a lot of research on ulu and has found many varieties on all the different islands. And what's really interesting is that they're all pretty much identified as the same species, and yet they look very, very different. And it's just a matter of time where the islanders cultivated varieties that were doing better on their individual islands, to the point where that's the only variety they would grow, or maybe two different varieties. So they did have distinctive looks. The leaves are different shapes, different sizes, and all that, and the fruits get bigger or smaller. But you know, I mean, Pacific Islanders settled on big volcanic islands like Hawaii, but they also settled on flat coral atolls that were just a few feet above sea level and were basically the tops of coral reefs. So different trees had to adapt to different growing environments. And so here, ulu was really important because you know, the fruits themselves are edible, of course. It is seasonal. There are some areas on each of the islands where the Hawaiians would harvest the last of the ulu crop, mash it up, make poi out of it, wrap the poi in banana leaves, and then bury the poi in the ground under the ulu tree to preserve it for as long as they could. In the event there was big storms that wiped out taro crops or sweet potato, they could always dig out the ulu poi and use that as a resource in the event of catastrophic storms and that sort of thing. I'm not sure if anybody's ever tried ulu poi. It does ferment really fast compared to taro poi, so it gets very pungent in odor, but it is, when it's fresh, it is very good eating, a little bit on the sweet side. Ulu, the trunks of the trees, so ulu is not reproduced from seed. It reproduces from root suckers, so it's a very slow process to make new plants from a breadfruit tree. And so the trees were really valuable, and they would only cut an ulu tree down if absolutely necessary. Now, ulu is the kino-lau of the god Ku, and so if a carving was going to be done of Ku, it was probably going to be done using the trunk of a breadfruit tree. And I know one of the carvings of Ku Ka'ilimoku that I've seen at the Bishop Museum was known to be carved out of a breadfruit tree trunk. And so anyway, ulu, very important, and grown on all the islands. Even the low, flat, dry island of Ni'ihau used to have ulu trees growing there. One of the features of the site here is a fish pond, which is behind me. I'm not sure if you can see it, but there is a fish pond behind me, and fish ponds are common on all the islands, more common in some areas than in others. But fish ponds, otherwise called lokoi'a, was probably the earliest known form of aquaculture. And so having become very proficient at farming and supporting large populations of people on all the islands, excuse me, while making a very small impact on the environment, they also decided that it was in their best interest to farm their fish and develop techniques to build rock walls to enclose the mouth of a stream or the corner of a bay that was not intrusive to the ocean environment itself, and in fact was so well thought out and constructed that fish ponds that exist today date back for hundreds, if not 1,000 years, and have survived hurricanes and tsunamis and all of that. One of the favorite things for me to look out of the window when you're flying inter-island is to see all the fish ponds on the south side of Molokai, on the leeward side of the island of Molokai. There's one fish pond after another, and they were all very productive. And so you have a big rock wall that's built that borders it with the ocean. then you have a little gate that's called the maka'aha, and you can raise and lower the gate depending on what the tide is, and that's basically how you would stock your fish pond. As the currents were going out, you would open the gate so the fish would swim in, the little young fish, because they were always looking for shallow water to get protection against bigger predatory fish. You would get your pond stocked naturally by doing that, and then these little fish would feed on the algae, the limu that was growing inside of the pond. So if a fish pond was built along a stream or at the mouth of a stream, you would then have a situation of brackish water, and the limu that grows in brackish waters is a little bit different, not necessarily the same limu that would be growing out in the open ocean. So I've been told stories of moi, for example, which is a very highly desirable fish, that were kapu to certain chiefs because the moi from certain fish ponds were really fat and really fragrant with the limu of that fish pond. And those of you who have eaten moi or ahole that come from brackish waters, you probably know what I'm talking about. They do have a different aroma and a different fragrance and a really rich fattiness that is very delicious. And so moi, a very highly desirable fish, raw, cooked, it doesn't really matter. But especially when they're in a brackish water fish pond and they come out fat, very, very good eating. So fish ponds generated all kinds of edible things. Aside from the fish themselves, again, there's different limu that grew on the walls that could be harvested. There were shrimps, crabs, and other things that were used as food sources. So fish ponds are very, very important. And it's really good to see that many fish ponds on all the islands are going through restoration phases. People are realizing what important cultural resources those are. And so even here on Kauai, we have a big fish pond restoration work going on. So the site here is I mean, you can see the condominiums in the background and all that. So the site here is quite different from what it was even when Prince Kuhio was born. But many of the rock walls are still here. We were walking back in where the scrub brush used to be, and you can see the lines where the stacked rock walls used to occur. And so, you know, an aerial picture would really give a good feel as to what was the layout of the land here. I think a good aerial photograph would help us find, you know, where the auwais were, and we know there were auwai throughout the Koloa field system, where the lo'i were, and then where some of the dryland malo were. So a question I get all the time, and I'm not a taro farmer, but I grow a lot of taro. We grow a lot of taro in our gardens, and a question I do get from time to time is when folks are talking about taro is, does that grow wetland or dryland? Well, all taro can be grown either way. Some taro prefer one form of cultivation over another, but all taro can be grown in a lo'i. All taro can be grown dryland. It's just when you grow them dryland, because taro is a thirsty plant, you have to mulch heavily, and you plant them farther apart so they have more area to draw from for resources and that sort of thing. When you grow them in a lo'i, in a wetland situation, then they can be planted more densely. You get a higher yield per acre that way, and when the leaves begin to unfurl, they really help with weed suppression. So when you're close to the ocean like this, then you can also stock your lo'i with young ahole. They can live in that fresh water, and then you can produce fish as well as kalo out of your lo'i. So that's the only big difference, a lo'i and a mala. A mala is any dryland cultivation of anything, but a taro grown in a dryland situation would be a mala as opposed to a lo'i.
Nakia I o kalani ana ole. Ea ea. Ea ea.